I seem to be giving a talk with Miriam Rothschild, which I dearly wish was the case. And I'm delighted I'm doing this with Nancy Ockenden, who works for the Endangered Landscape Programme. I've been asked to talk about a framework for how we can think about future issues. A lot of this has been already covered, so I've removed all the stuff that's already been done. So if anyone got any questions... Now, I love going to wildernesses, the Okavango, Thai rainforest, the Canadian Arctic, places like that. When people from those countries come and visit me, I like to show them some, and I'm amazed by those sites. When people from those countries come and see me, I like to show them some Breckland nature reserves, some English nature reserves. So this is the Breckland Artemisia Reserve. Has the biggest site, this is in an industrial estate, and it's about the size of this barn. And it has most of the population of Breckland mugwort. And here's the military orchid site, a few times bigger than this barn. And these are heavily managed and very successful. And my visitors always, they seem amazed by these sites too, which is very good. So this is what I call the succession paradox. So obviously, you leave land, you have bare ground, and that will turn to grass or heathland, and leave that will go to shrub or savanna, and leave that, it will go to woody stuff, or whatever we call it. And I've looked at the British terrestrial birds and very crudely classified them according to the habitat they use. Rather generously said stone curlew is like bare ground, about a quarter like grassland, half like savanna, a quarter like forest, but that includes species such as woodcock and long-eared owl that actually feed a lot on grassland, on open areas. So the succession paradox is that a lot of species require early successional stage habitats, and yet with succession will have late successional stage. And what's the reason for this? There are 4 reasons. First one is that these species, the early successional stage species, survived in riverbanks, shingle banks, that sort of thing. And undoubtedly there are a few species for which that's the case. But that's very rarely the case if you look at these habitats. They don't have those sorts of species. So that explanation clearly isn't right. The second one is that they arrived with man. And there's certainly some truth in that. If you look at the native species from the biological flora, mixed on a more up-to-date version, there's 1,400 native species, and then there's another 10% that are archaeophytes that arrived with man. Species like corncockle, cornsparrow, white dead nettle, whole set of species arrived as we disturbed the land more. And that's probably true for other taxa as well. Thirdly, we have disasters, and around the world this is probably very important. In the Caribbean, they have hurricanes coming through. The Nothofagus forest in Chile, often related to landslides. Faro is obviously important. In Britain, this undoubtedly happens along riverbanks, but probably isn't a major process. And then finally, here we have grazing. And I've been a great fan of Franz's work. I wrote about his thesis in the Conservation Handbook in 2000, so even before his book came out, I was a fan. And of course, the idea here is that grazers will keep the habitat as it is and then push it back so that cycle will take place. So what do we do about that? So one solution is you can just leave the habitat alone. But we know from Monkswood National Nature Reserve, famous for its butterflies, it was just left alone, fenced, not coppiced, succession took place, and of the 40 species, including pearl-bordered, small pearl-bordered, high brown, silver washed, these all went extinct, and another 8 species. It was pretty catastrophic, and this is generally the case. Leave habitats alone, and you lose the early successional stage species, and they disappear. So the next thing you can then say is, how can you manage them? Do you want to mollycoddle them, like we have here? We have the national, this area, which is fenced and cut and little patches of disturbance created. Or could we imagine that we could keep these going into some sort of meta-population where you have a larger habitat with areas being created and disappearing, and the rare species moving within these rare habitats? An example of what this might look like, this is about the only bit of natural Breckland, this is Wangford Warren. Imagine that on a larger scale, and then perhaps you could have some metapopulation with these endangered species occurring within that, rather than mollycoddling it. And then the next approach you can have is traditional management. By this I mean you fence the area off, you divide it up, you graze it, you cut it, you look after it, and that is hugely successful. We shouldn't denigrate it. That's how British nature conservation work, and it's very successful. An example where it probably hasn't worked, starry Breck lichen, habitat deteriorated. They tried to improve the habitat by introducing cattle grazing. I was chatting to Neil about this morning. And this was down, the starry Breck lichen was down to a few individuals, and it occurred in a sandy area, which they used as a wallow, and got rid of it. And easily it could have happened a cow could have pooped on it or something like that. When you get down to these few individuals, natural management is probably, traditional management is probably too risky. You really want to mollycoddle it. I think you probably want to fence it off and garden it and weed it and look after it until it can occur in a more natural system. So how do we create early successional stage habitats? I like to say that there's sort of four ways in which you can do this. What we do mainly is we sort of pickle in time. We keep our grasslands as grasslands by cutting and grazing. We keep our scrub as scrub by doing the same. That's kind of hardest. The next thing we could do is create disturbances. I used to be in charge of a management committee for Wildlife Trust, and I used to irritate them by playing the game of, can you name a reserve that wouldn't benefit from being bombed? And for some reason they thought this was offensive, but actually, I still play that game. It's very hard to actually think of somewhere that wouldn't benefit by a few bombs dropping over it, by creating those sorts of natural habitats. So finding ways of creating natural habitats is something we need. Or you can create natural processes of the sort that we've heard about. Leo's great talk this morning, we've heard a lot about today. And then finally, the idea that Charlie mentioned, which is new to me, this idea of creating ephemeral habitats, having grasslands, having farmland, and having a 20-year lease or whatever, so it can convert to scrub or whatever, attract nightingales, purple emperors or whatever, and then you push it back to farmland again. Exciting ideas. So these are the possible things you could do. So what do you want to do when? If you've got a little patch of some endangered species, I'd say you want to mollycoddle it. You want to fence it and protect it and look after it like that. That's kind of about the only thing you can really do. If you manage it, it's kind of risky. A cow might poop on it. If you leave it, succession will take place. Natural processes, the idea of allowing fires or whatever within the industrial estate, it's just not on. If you have a sort of traditional nature reserve, mollycoddling is just too expensive. The standard approach of dividing it up and cutting and grazing is probably the best thing to do. Leaving will be a bit of a disaster. Natural processes, sometimes you can do a bit of. If you have a landscape, it's impractical to mollycoddle. Managing gets too expensive, too difficult. Leaving is a bit of a disaster. Natural processes, this almost certainly is sort of the future for how we should be doing this. So what I'd like to do now is talk about some future drivers and then come back onto this. So for those of you, I'm sorry we're doing this, but anyway, we're leaving you. We love you, but we're leaving you. Which many of us feel very sad about. But anyway, we're doing it. So George Eustace, the Minister of State at DEFRA, has said we should be paying farmers and rewarding them for the ecosystem services they provide, not giving them a subsidy and saying they should be grateful. So he works for DEFRA. So what might this look like? So you can consider a British ecosystem services policy, and what might this look like? Well, the idea that's been suggested is that we want to selectively reduce subsidies to farmers. You can introduce minimum standards on pollution or environmental standards. At a national level, the British Ecosystem Service Policy will provide a strategic oversight and work out how to procure ecosystem services. We would encourage payment for ecosystem services. This is where the recipient pays the person who provides it. So Southwest Water is paying farmers to manage land in a way that improves their water supplies. But in practice, that's kind of difficult to organize, and that probably isn't going to be a major player, but do it where you can. Have it so that it has national procurement funds to say, how are we going to store carbon, reduce flood risk, et cetera, and do this competitively. Say, who is going to deliver on this? Put in your proposals, and then that will be considered. The second element has been suggested, which is local environmental governance organizations, or LEGOs. And the idea here is it's rather like national parks working. You would say, let's have, so Wolverhampton might say, we want to have green areas around Wolverhampton. Who's going to provide for this option competitively, put in suggestions, and we will fund areas so that we can have walking areas around Wolverhampton. Or York keeps flooding. Who's going to provide water protection schemes in the catchment of York to reduce flood? So it will be local organizations working on local problems. And then this is my contribution to this. You can imagine Lego bricks, filling up the landscape and protecting it. So this idea has been proposed. This working of the framework is by David Gareth and Ian Hodge, Centre for Science and Policy report. These are Cambridge academics, and you can say, well, they're obviously liberal environmentalists. But then this is our previous Environment Minister, Owen Paterson, who I think if you described him as a liberal environmentalist, he'd probably sue. But he has, on the Today programme, on Farming Today, he has provided almost an identical set of arguments. So it seems to me it is quite realistic that we might have this sort of an ecosystem policy within government. It's not impossible to think of. As Jonathan was just saying, there are increasing problems with aliens. So we have Dothostroma. I've just been teaching a field course the last 2 weeks, had someone surveying the ash trees, all of which had Chalara. The emerald ash borers heading our way. The eight-toothed spruce bark beetle may well come. We're having more and more pests and pathogens coming, as Jonathan said. And then the solution to that is likely to be to move away from monoculture to mixed species, because that both reduces the risk of infection, but also means if one species dies and it's only part of the community, that's all right, because other species can fill in the gaps. And if you have that sort of community, you've got to move to more naturalistic management because they have different life cycles, etc. So we might move to more naturalistic land management, as Jonathan said, because of these aliens. There's also climate change. And one of the things is, how do you manage for species with climate change? This is the red helleborine, fantastically rare orchid, and requires mycorrhiza and its own sort of niche. It's pollinated by male harebell carpenter beetles, who are pretty stupid things. They can't tell the difference between that and the harebell, so they go and fertilize these. And the harebell carpenter beetle requires holes drilled by beetles, so the harebell carpenter bee. The harebell carpenter bee requires holes in wood dug by beetles for them to persist. So this whole complicated ecosystem. And walk-biter crickets similarly have a complicated ecosystem. So with climate change, how are we going to restore that? And Charlie has 2,500 species here. How are we going to work out what they all require? The answer is we're not. But if you have a diverse landscape, with a bit of luck, these are going to find somewhere else where that niche will work, somewhere else within that landscape. And also within climate change, there's going to be increasing pressure for flood protection, etc. Just quickly want to say, don't read all the text. There's much more of a drive towards restoration. It's in one of the HE targets for the Convention of Biodiversity that we're going to restore at least 15% of degraded ecosystems. John, in his next lecture, is going to talk about an exciting venture, the Endangered Landscape Program, where we hope to be restoring, providing funds for restoration. So there's a changing in attitude. So I think there's going to be more habitat restoration taking place. I briefly want to say, so we're talking about restoring habitat like this, but a problem we have in Britain is we have this complex road system. So I put in animals on roads. I don't think these were all taken in Britain. But we want to restore landscape scale conservation, but there are roads everywhere. What do we do about it? Well, there are solutions to connect up the landscape, and here are some of the possible solutions. This is just for mammals. You're only allowed in for lunch when you can memorize all of these. These are the proposals that have been put forward just for connecting up bits of habitat or stopping roads causing damage to mammals. So the message is there are lots of different solutions. If you then look at the evidence, and I'm obsessed with evidence, the evidence for looking at tunnels, there's quite a few studies, and it turns out the details really matter. It turns out the studies aren't great looking at them. There's only a couple that look at the biological consequences. The details of how the tunnel is designed really matters. There are overpasses as well, and again, that's not studied particularly well. For bats, there's a suggestion if you have bat overpasses. When people have studied them, it turns out that bats can fly. So this doesn't work very well. So this is where bats used to cross, and this is the pre-construction route. This is where the bat gantry was, and they don't use it. And that's fine. And I really like people thinking of new ideas and testing them. The problem is that there were 12 gantries put up before anyone tested them, cost of over £1 million. They didn't work, and there's more going up. So we're not kind of testing and learning, which is what we should be doing. Think of new ideas. This is a good new idea. Put it up, see if it works, and we learn from it. That's great. But what we do is we just assume things work. Or if you look, this is Silviu Petrovan, who works with us. We've been interested in amphibian crossing points and shows that the evidence is very thin. So this is an amphibian crossing point. I think all the amphibians were provided with ladders so they could get through, or completely overgrown, completely inaccessible sites. Or when you put cameras in, turns out one of the major uses is cats, who now provide easier, safer access to the nature reserve and things they can eat. So the lessons are, for all interventions for conservation, they're widely accepted activities that people believe work but haven't been tested. They're widely accepted activities that just don't work, and we shouldn't really be doing, we should be testing to see whether or not they work. The details really matter, exactly how you create the tunnel. You can't just say, I'm going to create a tunnel. The details of how you do it really matter, and we should be really focusing on what works and what does not work and how you do that. And finally, we should be thinking, how can we make incremental benefits? How can we improve this and think of a better way of doing it and have a system whereby we can say, I think this might be a slightly better way of designing this bridge or this tunnel, and here's a test of it, and this is how society can learn from my experience. So the use of evidence in this is pretty thin and weak. Okay. So let's try to put all of this together. This is the framework I showed before, the best approaches. What are the future changes happening? Well, with pathogens, as Jonathan said, we're likely to move from the standard forestry management to much more natural processes within forest management. If we have a British ecosystem service policy, we're likely to be thinking much more about how we can do this on a landscape scale, how we can create the ecosystem services, the flood protection, the carbon storage, the biodiversity, the cultural needs that we want. And we're not going to do that on a little nature reserve management. It's going to be on a landscape scale. If we have more interest in landscape restoration through the program we've been talking about and just the general, well, the fact you're all here, means I think we're going to have more of this. With climate resilience, we're going to say how can we create new habitats for species that we don't know what they want? We need just create a landscape full of diverse stuff and hope it will persist in there. And for flood protection, etc., we probably want to move on a landscape scale. And then, if we can create these landscape scale habitats with rarities moving around within them, it may well be that our mollycoddle little sites are less necessary on the mollycoddling approach. So rather than feeding turtle doves patches of seed and looking after them in a sort of very precious way, as we've seen at Knepp, you can just create the landscape where they can flourish. Similarly with purple emperors. If we can create a landscape for the Artemisia that I showed you earlier, perhaps we don't need those sorts of Artemisia reserves in the same way. So what I'm saying is with these sorts of processes, we're going to need all three of these, but we can shift towards less concentration of these, less on these, as it gets replaced by a landscape scale. And then finally, in order to do this, we need an evidence base to do this, particularly important for patches where you're doing fiddly little bits. Sites, it's sort of important. But even for landscape scales, I showed how in connectivity, there's lots of things being done on faith and lots of things that are being done that absolutely clearly just don't work. The same is true for attempts at reintroduction. There's various different better ways of doing it that lessons aren't being learned. Habitat restoration, ways in which you graze, all this sort of stuff. We need to build on the evidence in order to achieve this. So I hope we've seen that this might be a way in which you can think about the framework of the future of landscape restoration and landscape creation. But I think we live in exciting times, and I look forward to seeing more of this happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ben Dempsey from University of Sussex. Thanks very much for that. Just on your question of a British ecosystem services policy, obviously completely understand the intent behind it. It sounds like it could become extremely complicated. How do you do that in a way that doesn't place even more burdensome bureaucracy on landowners and farmers than there already exists?
The Common Agricultural Policy is kind of quite a bureaucratic, expensive process. So the idea is to take a chunk of that money and have it through some competitive bidding process where you say, this is what we want, who is going to, and this is sort of high-level stewardship. That sort of works that sort of way. So people will put in applications and then they will be funded. And it will be either on a national scale or on this Lego brick scale where you'd say, rather like a national park works. A national park says, this is what we want to deliver, who's prepared to deliver on this, how can we do that? And the idea would be that communities would do the same.
Thank you. Vera, the last thing you said, evidence needs. There's one problem with the other party who has to accept the evidence, the scientific world. For instance, it's very difficult to get monitoring results getting peer-reviewed in a paper because they say it's not scientific. And another thing is, we have Knepp, I told you about the Oostvaardersplassen, but then they will say, where are the replicates? Because it's only one area. So something should be done in the scientific world as well, in the way how we look to data which we consider to be evidence.
I agree entirely, and that is a problem. In fact, we set up a journal, Conservation Evidence, for practitioners that we really want to know what people are doing and what the outcome is, but we're not fussed about the references and writing about the philosophy of life in the introduction of the discussion. We just, what have you done and what do you find? I think the other trick is that rather than saying, has this big project worked, which you don't learn that much from, is to say, what are the elements that you did and what could you learn from that? So we talked about, you said you can't get the moss layer removed, so succession doesn't take place, so pine seedlings don't regrow. You could say, well, let's look at what the effect is of introducing cattle in this area on the regeneration and compare that beforehand or with an area where that didn't happen. And just look at those fine details, because I think that's what we learn from. And that actually, I think, could be done by practitioners quite easily. And it's a question of thinking of setting up experiments when you're designing the restoration, and just look at little elements of it. I think if we did that, if everybody monitored some small-scale restoration every year or so and documented it, we'd be in a completely different place from conservation.
Thank you. It's Jonathan Spencer. Bill, I was very struck looking at your diagram, your concluding diagram, that you've sort of come to the similar conclusion to me, that actually there's a need for a...
Well, I've copied you from you being with us.
Thank you. It's the most sincere form of flattery.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
But you've sort of come to a similar conclusion that there's a new paradigm that needs to be created. You clearly work in an educational institution, quite an old one and a famous one. How would you go about instilling or building this knowledge culture that needs to be in the whole raft of operators that deliver that sort of landscape level change? How does one build a new paradigm and get it into practice in the way that we did 30 years ago with the whole historical ecology program?
Yeah, I think in terms of education, I've just been on a field course. I gave this talk as a practice the day before, and we've been talking very much about this sort of stuff. So it's the undergraduates are learning this sort of stuff. I think there's a willingness to see this sort of change. I think practitioners are excited by this sort of thinking. I think it needs a mechanism, it needs funding, it needs confidence, it needs case studies, it needs an underpinning of evidence. And I think, and there are early adopters, and there's that gap which people talk about, and I think showing that it would work, that's one of the major things, and that's one of the big successes of these Vadersplasn, is people go over and then they see it and think, we could do this. And we just need a lot more examples like that. And Knepp's obviously, the armies of people that come through Knepp is doing a huge amount of good there.
The really excellent thing about Knepp is not just that it's been done, but that Charlie's invested in the science of the effort.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Elaine Gilligan, Friends of the Earth. It relates actually back to Jonathan's presentation as well about natural capital. So where do you see the risks of biodiversity offsetting? Because that's the thing that we really have a problem with, the idea that you can remove nature as long as you put it back, but you clearly can't put back an ancient woodland. So there's a real risk in terms of the ecosystem services approach that we could be opening up a bigger battle around this idea of offsetting, which the UK government's been quite a strong proponent of, hasn't it? So what's your thinking on that, Bill?
I've been to offsetting sites in the US, which are just fantastic. So, Disney wanted to destroy this area. They wanted to offset the wetland areas that they might destroy, and they were creating this major new reserve in order to offset for the future damage. And that was fantastic. So it really can work. I think the trust, the concern for ancient woodlands, you cannot recreate in ancient woodlands. But if done well, what we have at the moment, we just irritate producers developers by protecting not very good bits of habitat and having super expensive, not very good restoration taking place. If you could take that out and do more impressive restoration elsewhere, it could work. But I think it's all in the detail, and it's all in the trust. And it's about, there's some things that we can't lose, but there's a lot of stuff where we could negotiate and say, okay, if you get rid of that and we have one of these, we're in a better position. But it is a very risky, there's a lot of trust before we can go there, I think. So I think we want to go there carefully. Yeah, indeed. It could work, but a lot of the experience in other sites is that it can be problematical. The evidence says that it's problematical.
Who's next? Who's next? I could just add to that, regarding the microphone. One of the reasons I put the excellent new college example in is that if it stays relevant for long enough, it does start to acquire its own continuity through time. So that college has been in place for 600 years. I'm hoping that Knepp will be in place for 600 years, provided it stays relevant. So, yes, you're absolutely right, Elaine, to be concerned about people taking advantage, but at the same time, change is happening anyway. and it would be unwise not to trade up wherever possible.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Bill.